like about it is it kind of injects a bit of reality from around the country and what people are actually thinking at a moment where it can be quite tempting for the party to look inward. So it's a really great educative experience to hear from John what just happened at the election, what's going to happen next, and what it all means for the future fortunes of this government. So we're going to start just by handing over to Sir John, who's got some slides, and I know you'll all be listening really carefully, but I want to say a huge thank you for doing this with us. Sir John.
Not at all. You're welcome. Can I borrow that one?
Yeah,
sorry.
Go for it.
Thank you very much, Polly. I think that was a warning that I might be about to rain ever so slightly on your parade. But doubtless, if you've been before and you turned up again, you know what you've let yourself in for. So what I want to do is, in a sense, to take a critical look at what Labour did and didn't achieve in the 2024 election. It's obviously the case that the Labour Party won a very substantial parliamentary majority. We take that as read, but the question is what lies underneath that. And to do that, of course, you kind of have any kind of critical evaluation. We need some criteria about which to judge it. So I think what I therefore decided to do was, in a sense, to take what I take to have been some of Labour's objectives, both during the course of the last Parliament and then also more immediately in the run-up to the election. Obvious objective number one was to make Labour electable, which is code for to make it look more respectable than some people felt it was under Jeremy Corbyn. Then secondly and crucially, there was a very clear decision that the party needed to try to reconnect with some of those traditional working class Labour voters who voted Leave, the loss of which was epitomised by the loss of the so-called red wall seats, and that unless and until that was done, there was little prospect of Labour being able to win an election. To that was then connected the important objective of making Labour's vote more geographically efficient. One of the things that people like me would say is that if you just assumed there had been no, we just kept the existing geographical distribution of party support, that we would end up with the Labour Party needing something like a 13-point lead just to get an overall majority of one. So trying to deal with that situation was also clearly an objective, and that was partly connected to that point about reconnecting with Labour's traditional working class vote. Those perhaps are the three criteria which, as it were clearly in evidence throughout the whole of the Parliament. We then come to perhaps a couple of more short-run things. One was quite clearly to avoid being seen as a high-tax party, as a consequence which the Labour Party in opposition agreed not to one, but to two cuts in national insurance that were put forward by the then Conservative government. And then more immediately, and I guess I'm kind of maybe vaguely responsible for this, but during the middle of the election campaign, British Shares Attitudes kind of lobbied into the mix the fact that levels of trust in politics and government was as low as they ever had been. And certainly, Sir Keir seemed to pick that message up and started talking about the need to restore trust. And we'll come back to that towards the end of the talk. It's not quite structured along those five things, but almost. And along the way, I'm going to talk about some of the perhaps downsides of the pursuit of these strategies, as well as the extent to which they might actually have been pursued. Okay, all of you presumably know all this. This is the bit that you all want to talk about, and that's the bit you all want to ignore. But let me just gently remind you that this is the lowest share of the vote won by any majority government in British electoral history, let alone a government with a majority of over 170. It beat the previous record, which of course was Labour in 2005, when it got 36% of the vote across Great Britain. So that's point number one, is that in terms of winning votes, absolute votes, this was not a particularly successful election. Let's just hang on to that. The next point to note is that basically, well, 2 points to note. One is the only part of the country where Labour really did make significant progress across the board was in Scotland. But that is part of story number 2, which is that being in government, full stop, was bad news in July. So, yep, the UK Conservative government got a walloping from the electorate. The SNP got a very substantial rebuff, but so also did Labour in Wales, where, of course, it is responsible for the devolved parliament. Governing at the moment in a situation where the fiscal power of the UK state is more or less been maxed out, the public services are not working, and the economy is flatlining. This is a tough gig. And welcome to the tough gig that you have now taken over. This is not going to be easy so far as satisfying the electorate is concerned. A couple of other preliminary or not entirely preliminary remarks. We should remember the political history of the last parliament. And basically, if I wanted to give the world's shortest lecture on what to explain the outcome of the 2024 election, I would just have to utter 2 words: Johnson and Truss. They are the principal architects of the outcome of the 2024 election, because, difficult though it may now be to remember, for the first 2 years of the last parliament, the Conservative government was never ever consistently behind you in the polls, which by the standards of most parliaments since the 1960s was a remarkably good record. Then there was the small matter of Owen Paterson, but then there was the much bigger issue at the beginning of December 2021, where the first stories emerged about the more liberal interpretation of the COVID regulations in 10 Downing Street than anywhere else inside the UK. The Tories lost about 6 points in 6 weeks, from which they never recovered. And then the Conservative Party, in their wisdom, of course, elected Liz Truss. We had the Liz Truss fiscal event. That was a disaster with the markets. The Conservative Party lost another 6 points in 6 weeks, and basically the die was cast. The only other really important development thereafter, although it actually did start to begin at the time of the Liz Truss fiscal event, is the rise of reform. That occurred continuously thereafter. And curiously, in particular, it particularly took off in October of November last year, which is roughly the time that the Conservative government decided to focus on immigration as one of its central policy priorities. Peculiar that, wasn't it? Anyway, crucial point number 1, therefore. This is an election which it is very, very easy to read as basically, simply and primarily an election about rejection of certainly the UK Conservative government and about governments more widely. And that, for a start, begins to raise a question about the extent to which people were voting for you, as opposed to using you as one of a number of available instruments to express their discontent with the current government. Now, that said, am I going to be all doom and gloom? Labour did achieve some of its objectives. Certainly, if you regard this as a good thing, and some in this room may not, but the Labour Party did gradually change its image. It was a dramatic change shortly after Sir Keir became leader. But the interesting thing was that even thereafter, as a gradual, continual process, the Labour Party increasingly came to be seen as moderate. And that arguably at least meant you got yourselves into a position where when voters were looking for somebody to vote for in order to express their discontent with the Conservative government, that you were in a position potentially to profit. Some progress also in persuading people that, yeah, you might be willing to allow these guys to run the country, the sense that the Labour Party is ready for government. That said, however, still on YouGov's measure at least, slightly more people saying they didn't think you were ready than think you did. But also notice, when is this? This is the Liz Truss fiscal event. In other words, a lot of the answers to this question are relative, not absolute. And basically, following the Liz Truss event, a lot of voters judged that, well, they couldn't possibly be any worse, could they? Surely not. But therefore, again, it's not necessarily clear how far it's a measure of enthusiasm for Labour. That said, and again, to give Labour credit, although they haven't really, for most of the last Parliament, been convincing people that they were ready for government, on another measure from Ipsos, which is rather more positive, during the campaign, things did come up positive. 47% thinking that they agreed that they were worth, 34% not. Certainly better than in 2019 or 2017 or 2015, even better slightly than the Tories in 2010, but still not as good as Blair in 1997. This is the point where I get slightly more risky talking about this in front of this audience. A lot of excitement in the last 2 or 3 days, couple of weeks, about the unpopularity of the Prime Minister. I don't want to be nasty, but this is not news. Okay? This is YouGov's time series. The blue line is whether people regard Secure favourably or unfavourably. This is people's attitude towards the Labour Party. When he was initially became leader, Secure was highly popular, not least, of course, because a lot of people said they didn't know. But you can see what happened in 2021 when there were collywobbles about Secure's leadership, and rumours about him resigning, the loss of the Hartlepool by-election, etc., etc. And although his popularity improved in the wake of Partygate and again in the wake of the Liz Truss fiscal event, again it was relative, but it's never ever sustained. And certainly, if you compare his popularity on Ipsos's data, which you've got a nice long time series, and therefore you can compare his popularity with that of previous leaders. Not only is his net satisfaction level less than that of Tony Blair, but it's also even not as good as David Cameron in the last 3 months in the run-up to the 2010 election. So suggesting that the Labour Party was offering people somebody about whom they felt enthusiasm, that they felt was necessarily somebody that they regarded with in a favourable fashion, that is certainly not part of the project that ever got anywhere very far. Okay, moving on now to that second criterion about reconnecting with Leave voters. This is data from a couple of, well, I've used lots of polling data, but this is looking at how people voted now in 2024, according to not how they voted in 2016, but their current preference on Brexit. And it's showing you for both those who would vote rejoin and those who would vote to stay out, how they say they voted. Point one, if anybody says to you, Brexit isn't making a difference to how people vote, just quietly sit them down and explain to them that this is not, just because the politicians don't want to talk about it, doesn't mean to say that it isn't still structuring the vote. Labour did have had some relative success in increasing its support amongst those who would vote to stay out, as compared with what it's doing under rejoin. But given that the coalition that Boris Johnson pulled together in 2019, which gave him his victory, he got 80% of Leave voters to vote for him, but that literally collapsed. You can see who picked it up, and we'll come back to this later on. It was Reform what picked up most of the Leave vote that the Conservatives could not hang on to. Labour only picked up a few crumbs of it. And that does therefore mean that when you start looking at the composition of Labour's vote, it's actually the vote that's changed least since 2019 in terms of the balance of rejoin and stay out voters. Because the party's only made minor progress amongst those who vote to stay out. Meanwhile, those who vote to stay out are fewer in number in the electorate than they were back in 2019, let alone 2016. You put those two things together, yeah, Labour's now got about 81% of its vote coming from rejoiners as opposed to the 86% of people who would vote to remain in December 2019. actually the Tory vote is now much less of a stay out vote than it was, because they've lost so much of their Leave coalition, and the Democrats also have changed a bit. So that part of the project really never got anywhere very far. So also did not the part of the project that said that Labour needs to reconnect with its traditional working class base. This is showing you the data of Ipsos, how people voted by social grade. These are the folk in the more working class occupations. These are professional middle class occupations. Labour, 36% amongst AB voters, up 5, 33% amongst DU voters, down 3. There is no gap, no difference between working class and middle class voters, as was the case in 2019, in willingness to vote Labour. Equally, the Conservative Party, there is very little relationship in class and vote. Which is the party that is, relatively speaking, most successful amongst working class voters? It is Reform. And which is the party that's most successful in picking up middle class voters? It is the Liberal Democrats. But our two big parties, which traditionally were firmly embedded, the Conservatives in the middle class, Labour in the working class, that picture has not returned in 2024. And that therefore, certainly the expectation that Labour would have to reconnect with Leave voters and reconnect with working class voters to have any chance of winning the 2024 election, that supposition, which was not arguably unreasonable in 2020, did not prove to be accurate. Labour have managed to win despite, rather than because, of its ability to achieve that objective. So, how then do we get to Labour where it is? Well, of course, what is true is, again, although it didn't particularly reconnect with Leave voters, it did dramatically improve the geography of its vote. The 2024 election has been, the outcome in terms of seats has been affected by geography more than any previous UK election. But basically, what I'm doing here is showing you the change in Labour vote according to, on the far left-hand side, the seats you were trying to defend. On average, your vote was down, in some places down heavily, in places you were trying to defend, but it's fine. Apart from a few seats, you hung on to virtually all of them. Here are the seats where you're 10 to 20 points behind in 2019, or 20 to 30 points behind. That's where your vote went up. That's where it, and of course, it meant it went up where it could count. But what's this particularly to do with effective targeting by Labour? Well, I would already suggest to you, I don't think it was part of the strategy to lose some percent of the vote in places that the party was defending. That made its vote more efficient, but I don't think that was probably part of the plan. But the truth is, what was also going on here, and again, it takes us back to this feeling that this was an election in which voters were voting against the government. What I'm now doing is breaking down the seats according to the left-hand side are seats where Labour were challenging the Conservatives. Labour second, Conservatives first in 2019. Then you've got the seats where the Democrats were the challengers, and then you've got everything else. 2 points to note. One, the Conservative vote fell much more heavily in places they were trying to defend. Again, the rejection of the Conservatives is crucial here, and the way that vote collapsed in seats is absolutely fundamental to your ability to win so many seats. But secondly, note, you're up here, the seats where you're challenging the Conservatives. You're not up here, where the Democrats were the challengers. The Democrats are up where they were challengers, and they were actually going down where you were second. The scale and the consistency of the tactical voting in this election is again truly quite remarkable. But again, it indicates the extent to which the elections were basically taking whatever stick was available to them with which to beat the Conservatives. And that again is very much the foundation of your support. Indeed, just to underline how important the change in the geography is. On the first two columns here, there are two different ways of doing it. This is what my former university supervisor, now sadly no longer with us, David Butler, this is what he would have said would be the expectation. In other words, We assume that the Conservative vote goes down by 20 points everywhere. We assume the Labour vote goes up by about 2 points everywhere. In other words, we take the national vote totals and assume that these would happen in each every constituency. If that had happened, you wouldn't have got an overall majority. And the Tories would have had twice as many seats as they actually did. The change in geography from 2019 to 2024 as a result of that anti-Conservative tactical voting and the collapse of the Conservative vote in the seats they were trying to defend is absolutely fundamental to the outcome of this election and so much more important than vote shares. Now, perhaps also we need to remind ourselves that perhaps there were some potential downsides to the strategy that Labour was pursuing. One was that in not being really wanting to talk about Brexit, not really going quite soft on issues like transgender, equally very keen to say we're patriotic, etc., etc. Was there a risk that you might lose some votes somewhere? Well, here's exhibit number one. This is vote by age. Why do I show it? Well, one, because first of all, to show that whereas social class doesn't make much difference to Conservative and Labour support, age still does. You, fortunately, are the party of young people, which is in a better position to be than to be the party of older people, which is where the Conservatives find themselves. But notice here and here, the Labour Party lost vote ground heavily, basically amongst those people who came of age during the last Parliament. So the comparison, obviously, with 18 to 24-year-olds 5 years ago, so it's not the same group of people. But basically, the Greens gained ground quite noticeably amongst the younger section of the electorate. They were also doing, by the way, quite well amongst university graduates. Oh, yes, of course, by the way, who is the core Labour voter? Sorry, it's not the person in a working class job. It's a young university graduate working in the professions. That is now your core vote. It is still your core vote. But the Greens here also nibbling away at it in a way that you might want to be aware of. And indeed, we can also go further and show that where the Greens did best, which is here, so we go from left to right, these are the seats where the Greens did best, advanced most. That's where you did worse, that's where your vote was falling away. So again, evidence the Greens were hurting you. And what also you can do, I can do with some data I've just got my hands on, is I can divide voters basically into folk who are socially liberal, who are the folk here in blue, and the folk who are much more socially conservative, so these are the folk much more concerned about immigration. These are the folk in grey. And what I invite you to note is that basically you're doing equally well amongst the two groups in terms of retaining support amongst 2019 Labour voters. So I'm not saying you were as popular amongst this group. What I'm saying is you were successful in retaining socially conservative voters who voted Labour in 2019. But notice the Greens particularly picked up some of the more socially liberal voters who voted for you in 2019. So you put all that together and you begin to get a picture. It wasn't just the Conservatives who had to worry about competition other than from you, i.e. they had to worry about reform. You now also need to think about a world in which you may also need to think about the Greens. And that an election which produced in many respects a multi-party contest is, you may now to think about British politics in the future as being a multi-party contest. Probably don't need to tell you this, but obviously the other thing where the party's stance came up, partly unstuck, was in seats with large numbers of people identify as Muslims, and this Ipsos data up there as well, which shows very clearly that the party's support fell heavily amongst those from minority background, and particularly amongst those of an Asian background. So there's another downside. And then, just to underline a point I've already made, again, which perhaps is not that comfortable a point to appreciate, is that at the end of the day, The other crucial foundation of Labour's success was the success of reform, because this is showing you, according to 4 different sources, where 2019 Tory voters went if they didn't vote for the Conservatives in 2024. You picked up about 1 in 8 of them, perhaps, which was well done on the figure at the time of the Liz Truss fiscal event. At the time of the Liz Truss fiscal event, you were picking up the votes off the Tories. Reform were picking up twice as many votes as you were off the Conservatives. And indeed, it is the impact of reform. Again, I'm going from left to right. Left-hand side is where reform advanced least. The right-hand side where they advanced most. Which party suffers the more that reform do well? It's the Conservatives, thereby opening the door for you and the Liberal Democrats to pick up seats that you would otherwise not have got. I mean, John Major seems to think that because you picked the seats up of the Conservatives, therefore it was to you that the Conservatives lost the vote. That's just a basic psychological error. Basically, the reform took the votes, and you then grabbed the seats along with the Democrats. Now, moving on more rapidly to the last couple of points about taxation and spending. And to kind of raise a couple of wider points to think about. This is a slide to explain why some of us never thought that the Jeremy Hunt 2p NIC cut was ever going to work, and it didn't work. What I'm showing you here is the proportion of 2019 Conservative voters, the don't knows and the not votes are all in there, who were willing to vote for the Conservative again, broken down by the blue bars are the people who thought the taxation spending should go down, and the grey bars are the ones who think should go up. These are 2019 Tory voters. And the crucial point to note is there is no difference. There wasn't any relationship between people's reluctance to vote for the Conservatives again and their attitudes towards taxation. This was not voters' concern. Oh, and by the way, I mean, so far as people did want it reduced, they were much more likely to wander off to reform than they were to you anyway. But the point is, this wasn't the issue. It never was the potential rescue issue for the Tories that they thought. Why? Well, it's not complicated. The focus of the public seems to be on the state of the public services. It is satisfaction with the NHS, and I've just been able to update it with data for just after the election. Satisfaction with the NHS has fallen off the cliff. And people's evaluations of the NHS were very strongly related to whether or not they were willing to vote Conservative again. So taxation wasn't the issue. It was the state of the public service that was the issue that was driving the vote. Amongst those 2019 Tory voters who thought the Conservative the health service was going badly, only a quarter were willing to vote for them again. Amongst a very small number of people who thought it was going well, about 3/4 were willing to vote for them again. When Jeremy Hunt found some money down the back of the sofa to fund the national insurance cuts, he would have been much better advised to have spent the money on solving between the doctors' strike and trying to get the waiting times down. For the Conservatives, but not for you, that would have been actually a more efficacious issue. And notice, by the way, this is also an issue for reform voters. Reform voters are not just concerned about immigration. Immigration helped to determine where they went to if they were discontented with the Conservatives, but their discontent is also with the state of the public services. But behind this, there is then a wider question. And it's a wider question on which perhaps both Conservative and Labour politicians have not necessarily been adequately attuned. And that is, let's bear in mind, everybody talks about austerity under the Tories. I mean, hey guys, give them a break. They presided over the biggest expansion of the state since 1945 in the last parliament. All right? We're now spending about 45% of GDP on public services and raising in taxes. But the question that arises from that is what's been the public reaction? What we would normally expect, and what happened under New Labour, is that the public eventually said, hang on, great that the waiting time's down, great that the schools are better because you know his taxes a bit less. And this is illustrated by this slide here from British Social Attitudes. These are the people who say that taxation should go up. These are the folks who says keep it as is. Very few people say reduce it. But the crucial point is in the dying days of the new Labour administration, the tide moved away from expanding the state. But despite the expansion of the state, the dramatic expansion of the state in the last Parliament, the public so far show relatively little sign of having rebelled against the expansion of the state. And this raises a question to which we won't have the answer in 5 years, but it's a question on which this government will have to try to make the right guess, which is whether or not the pandemic has changed the public's attitudes towards the role of the state, and that like World War II, which is the last time the state really expanded, the experience of the state rescuing the labour market, rescuing the financial markets in the pandemic means that people say, oh, hang on, state activity is not necessarily so bad at all. That is something to think about. And therefore, perhaps both parties, in focusing so much on keeping taxes down and talking much less about the public expenditure side, may well have missed the public mood in the 2024 election. Finally, and briefly, on trust, a little issue that kind of seems to have come back to rebound on the party. Point one, elections are good for trust and people's perceptions of how the country is being governed. This is a question that goes all the way back to 1973 about how right is Britain being governed. These are the folk who say it needs a great deal of improvement. These are saying not very much. This is a post-election reading. There's been a bounce back. There's always a bounce back after an election. But here's a reading on trust. And what I've done here quite deliberately is to pick out just those readings that British Socialists has taken, including for the most recent survey, immediately after an election. And what you will see is that the proportion of people who say they almost never trust politicians is higher than it has been after any previous election, and the proportion who say they do so most of the time is lower. So there is a lot. I mean, Sir Keir Starmer was right. There is no trust. There is still no trust. The election of a Labour government has not dispelled simply that low level of trust. So you do therefore need to think about, as a government, about the actions that you take in order to ensure that you do not lose trust. One of the things to do with ethics and integrity, we can talk about that if you want. The other thing I know you want to do is to improve the NHS, because it's still the case that people who think the NHS is doing badly have low levels of trust. Reversing the public policy failures of the last 5 years will also be a crucial part of the trust agenda, as well as thinking about who you take money from. And on that note, I will stop.
Thank you so much for that. I can't tell you what it was like sitting up here and just watching your brows furrow more and more through that conversation and through that presentation. There was so much in there, and some quite difficult messages as well. I've got a couple of questions I just wanted to follow up with, and then I'm really keen to bring in the audience. The first is, how are we witnessing the death of the two-party system? Is this what we're seeing here, a real splintering and wearing away of any party loyalty?
I mean, the answer to probably is almost inevitably, perhaps. But the point is, we can at least contemplate the possibility. I mean, it was something that people in my trade talked about a great deal, all the way through to the beginning of this century. And then along came the 2017 and 2019 elections, when the whole process seemed to go back into reverse. But only 58%. I've kind of harangued your performance a bit, but I'm going to go talk to the Tories next week. You can imagine what I'm going to say to them. But in that case, it's by far and away the worst result since and including 1832. But the point, the serious point, therefore, is that only 58% of people voted for Conservative or Labour, which is the lowest combined share for the two parties at any election since and including 1922, which is the first election in which the Labour Party became the Conservatives' principal competitors. Now, so point one is, therefore, we've gone back already to a low share of the vote being cast for the two largest parties. Some still remember spring 2019 when the opinion polls were saying 25% each. It was Boris Johnson who kind of turned that around. But it's then also a matter of judgment. And I guess the thing to think about is this. As I said, this is a tough gig that this government is going to inherit. And we can already, the opinion pollsters are kind of licking their wounds a bit at the moment. We've not got very much from their opinion polls, but such as we've got suggests that Labour's voters are down even from the 35% that we got in July. So it's going to be a tough gig. Maintaining the confidence of the electorate, an electorate which never really bought into you, as opposed to, oh, thank God, we've got rid of that other lot. It's a difficult gig. So you can see that this government could easily run into trouble. It's not guaranteed to, but it could do so. We can also see that it's possible that the Conservative Party might take a wee while to recover. I mean, it's going to partly depend on the outcome of this leadership contest. And certainly at the moment, they're going nowhere. You can already see in the opinion polls, support for the Democrats up, support for the Greens is up, and support for Reform is up. Now, much will also then depend on the ability of the opposition parties to frame a narrative that explains why Labour is doing badly in their view and why you can't trust the Conservatives and why you need to turn to them. And we could happily talk endlessly about the potential opportunities and limitations that face them. But the point is, that's probably where we're at. So there's nothing guaranteed. A politically successful and Labour government, which is also successful in terms of delivering policy, the two-party system may be restored. And equally, if the opposition parties don't take the advantage, it may be restored. But it's again also worth remembering, the UK has been exceptional in terms of West European democracies in not having seen some fundamental change in its party system. Now, north of the border, it happened in 2015. I mean, strictly speaking, we were talking about an England and Wales party system. Now, of course, in Scotland, the SNP has gone down, so there's been some recovery. But Scotland shows you there is no guarantee that the two-party system will survive. And you can certainly, at the moment, see its potential weaknesses.
Thank you for that. So your message to this government is this is a tough gig, or that's kind of one of the conclusions. Having that historically low vote share for a winning government makes it a really tough gig. I'm going to ask you to just switch hats from pollster to strategist.
Yeah.
What should they do?
Well, I think I've said enough this evening to illustrate why a message that says it's all terrible and it's the other lot's fault, that isn't accompanied by an attempt to construct a narrative about the future, would potentially go down badly, because that's not what the public want to hear. The question mark I would have, and this is where the Sir Keir style of personal ratings kick in, is whether or not, this is something for you guys to worry about, whether or not Sir Keir Starmer has the ability to construct that narrative. Rishi Sunak couldn't construct the narrative. I certainly don't think that Sir Keir constructed the narrative during the election. The question is, does he have the political ability to do so? And that is still an open question. But constructing that story is important. And number two, you can see how the public are perhaps now likely to be even more censorious about issues of ethics, etc. And that, some of the mistakes this government is just doing a straightforward political antenna. It's just spotting the bear traps and quickly enough. And the government does seem to be very slow. It's beautifully illustrated by the whole Natalie Elphing affair. I mean, the moment Natalie Elphing was admitted to the Parliamentary Labour Party, we all went to, what about Diane Abbott? What about Diane Abbott? It was perfectly obvious what was going to happen. And we've seen other examples of this happen more recently. More broadly, I think politicians of all sides have been constantly making a major mistake about focusing on personal mistakes and foibles and all the rest of it. But the truth is, what you sow, you'll reap. And I think you must expect, given the way that you very heavily attacked the integrity of the last Conservative government, that the Conservative Party is going to return it in spades. It's exactly what I mean. Tony, Labour between 92 and 97 attacked the Conservatives on the sleeves. The Conservatives returned it in spades after Blair became Prime Minister. So that you've already said. So I think the truth is that's a mistake you've already made about talking about trust and integrity. But you now need to be aware of the pitfalls. More broadly, I guess I would say that, well, again, I mean, some of us think that the other problem the government now faces is that in having said so much about not increasing taxation, again, it's already made life difficult for itself. So I'm going to be slightly awkward to you, Polly. I think I would have rejected the second national insurance cut on the grounds it was unfunded. If you read your OPR report, it was unfunded. I would have been much more careful what I said about trust, particularly about to an election. But I would also have wanted to construct a narrative by now. The problem is those are all weaknesses that are now beginning to show through. The question is, what can you do about it at this stage?
Thank you so much for that. We're going to take some audience questions. Have we got a roving mic? Yes, brilliant. Okay, I'm going to go to the person at the front, and then to the on the right there. We'll take two at a time, if that's all right.
Sort of on your discussion earlier when you mentioned about with like the low vote share, it was like the multi-party system.
Yeah.
Do you think that maybe this might mean that like with following elections it can be quite hard to predict really? Because I think with this one, when you've got an abnormally high number of seats for such a really low vote share, and obviously as you say with like voters like splintering everywhere now, obviously we don't know, say there's more independence, like what happened with reform really. Do you think maybe it's quite difficult really, or is there like a new sort of model that can sort of
sure? I mean, the short answer to you is I think it's difficult. It's difficult simply because we now have so many more players in the game, right? Okay, one of the things to note about the 2024 election, because it's not just to do with votes, it's also to do with organisational capacity. This was the first election in British history in which 5 parties pretty much fought every constituency everywhere. And then in Scotland and Wales, it's 6. The Greens are now organised everywhere, right? The Democrats, one of the reasons why they survived the travails of the coalition is that they had one man and one woman and a dog in every constituency to keep the organisation alive, right? I think now to watch with Reform is, are they successful in setting up an organisational structure everywhere? That is now the objective they set out for themselves. If so, the point is then, it comes back to, I mean, something I was talking about earlier. One of the lasting images for me of the 2024 election was the first of the 7-way leaders debates, when Penny Mordaunt and Angela Rayner thought they could have a private conversation with each other and ignore everybody else. And in my view, that was a very clear illustration of how they failed to understand that we were no longer in a world where if I can manage to defeat that lot, I've done my job and I don't have to worry about anything else. If we're now talking about a world in which parties are having to fight competition from more than one source, the game inevitably becomes more complicated, more difficult to do. But of course, what is also true is that insofar as we've got third parties with large votes, and in one case, the Democrats at this time managed to beat the election system, the world of hung parliaments is still potentially upon us at some point in the future. And then although I suspect that this party will not pursue its commitment to increase proportional representation, for which it voted in 2022, I think in terms of civil society, that debate's going to be going on. And if and when we get a hung parliament, we will be back to talking about the electoral system.
Brilliant, thanks. On the right here, we will take them one by one. That's working, I think. Can I just check if we got online questions as well? No, okay.
We bored the online audience.
Thanks very much. That's brilliant, John. Thanks. I wanted to ask you about the volatile electorate and the anti-incumbency. Obviously, anti-incumbency is this huge force internationally. You've seen it all the elections this year.
Sure.
And also, maybe due to that, we've seen parties replacing their leaders between elections. So, Boris Johnson won a huge election victory and was replaced 3 years later. And Joe Biden's the first incumbent president not to run for re-election. He's been replaced, but obvious reasons. Do you think we'll see more of that effect of parties replacing their leaders because of this volatile electorate and anti-incumbency move?
Do I hear the voice of a Labour membership that is willing to unseat its leaders? I ask myself. History suggests that the Labour Party is much more difficult to unseat Labour leaders than it is Conservative ones. But at the end of the day, the simple answer to you is that party leaders, prime ministers remain prime ministers for so long as they can maintain the confidence of their parliamentary party. The problem with Johnson is that his administration literally collapsed. He could no longer form a government. Therefore, it was the end of the story. I think the other point I'll make, and I'll shut up, is that just bear in mind that more people have become prime minister for the first time as a result of a change of premiership in the middle of parliament than have done so as a result of becoming prime minister of the immediate back of an election. People fail to remember their British political history. People get terribly exercised about changing prime ministers in midstream. That is actually the more common experience, and always has been.
At the back, please, gentlemen in the middle. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm interested to know, John, your view on recent riots and how that's going to play out in the local general elections coming up, and how it might impact on either Labour votes or reform, and how it just generally just play out.
You mean the riots in the summer?
Yeah.
History suggests that these things don't have much in the way of long-term impact. I mean, the government, obviously one thing Keir Starmer knew about was how to use the criminal justice system in order to deal with the immediate sources of this issue. There were serious riots in 2011, and and before that as well. These things tend not to leave much of a long-term political impact, and I don't expect these to do so either.
Are they kind of seen as random rather than systemic?
Well, they're random in the sense that they always occur in the summer, right? And people kept on asking me why don't we have any riots in Scotland? To which I'm not entirely facetious. I mean, for anybody who knows about the summer, I mean, you guys might be complaining about the weather. The west of Scotland, an absolutely miserable summer. The idea that you're going to stand out and riot about anything was inconceivable. But they always happen in the summer. I think the only other thing I would say is you should not regard any kind of riot or any kind of street demonstration as necessarily an indication of public opinion is that. I mean, the classic example is that I think Lisa Brooks has gone, so I can now attack journalists. Standard line of journalists is that younger people are more concerned about climate change than older people, and that's because of who they see on the streets. It's not true, right? Actually, it is older people, if anything, are slightly more concerned about climate change than younger people. But the point is, this was something. There is a section. We should not underestimate. There is a section of our society which feels culturally challenged by immigration, perhaps feels particularly culturally challenged by the growth of the Muslim population, and who were connected to social networks where conspiracy theories that put these things together were all too readily believed. Yeah, of course there's a section of our society that believes that, but I don't think it's any bigger now than it was 12 months ago. And more broadly, without trying to be too optimistic, the long-term trend in our society is to being somewhat more accepting of diversity. There is no doubt that there is a high level of immigration to create their own challenges.
Thank you. I'm looking for a lady back there on the left.
It's just a bit of a two-stranded question, but I'll try and be quick. So we saw some data on vote share and voting by class, so social class and social grade. First of all, do you have that breakdown or something similar by income itself? And the second,
if you send me an email, I can send it to you.
Okay, and the second, cool. and just general. And the second point is sort of just on social class itself. Like these days, university education has expanded massively over the past 30, 40 years. We now have people leaving university to work in hospitality, warehouses, even being on benefits. and we also see some tradespeople making quite a lot of money. Is maybe the way we think about class. Could Labour basically build its reputation as being a party of working class, and we accept as working class maybe looks a bit different today than it used to?
Yeah, sure. I mean, of course, everybody talks about working people rather than the working class because there's one of big. Oh, sure, the occupational structure has changed, but all I was simply doing was taking the party at its own word, and that, you know, I think the party went through something of an existential crisis. It wants to think of itself as a party that speaks on behalf of the less well-off, the more working class end of British society. But actually, it's very, very difficult to say that that is clearly the case. And, you know, I mean, again, I'll make myself even more popular. I mean, you know, one of the ironies of what happened in 2019, I mean, Tony Blair was aware of the change in the occupational structure and was very, very keen for Labour to become relatively more popular amongst middle-class voters. Jeremy Corbyn delivered Tony Blair's vision. I've now made myself unpopular with everybody in this room. But the truth is, I mean, if you go back to 1997, it's very clear. Labour's vote was much higher, even at that stage, amongst those in the C2 and D groups than it was amongst the A, B, and C1s. This time, there's no sign of it at all. So sure, that in a sense is not necessarily bad news, because those in white-collar jobs are becoming more and more numerous over time because it's become a knowledge economy. You can say it's about a social democratic party adapting to the changing occupational structure. That's fine. I'm quite happy to take that argument. But the point is, you then still need to overcome your traditional image as a party of, oh, but hang on, we're for the workers. Well, only the definition of the workers that you now represent is certainly much broader than it once was.
Brilliant. If we're quick, I think we can take two more questions. Gentleman in the middle here, Hannah. Actually, Hannah, stay where you are because I was going to come to him next. So two quick ones, yeah. Yeah, go on.
All right, then. It's going to be an end of the night question anyway. So, okay, well, with all that in mind, Sir John, and I know 5 years is a long time, can we get your 2029 predictions, please?
Wait, that was my last question. So we save time. Go for it.
Okay. Point one is that the most crucial lesson of the last Parliament is do not attempt to forecast the outcome of the next election on the basis of the last one. Two, as I've already suggested in my remarks going on, I think it's very, very uncertain. It's just that the next election could end up being more fragmented than the last one. And we could, I mean, February 1974, with hindsight, proved to be a really crucial election. It was the first election when the Liberal Party started fighting everywhere, and we entered the world of three-party politics, and we never really entered it, all right? And the question is whether 2024, 50 years later, is now again a crucial stepping stone. And as a result, this may be an election where we say, well, actually, two-party politics disappeared. I mean, certainly if you look in terms of the structure of competition at the constituency level, it's only a minority of constituencies now where Conservative and Labour share first and second place. Okay, so that's one of the ways it's being undermined. But you know, at that point, you know, it depends on events, it depends on the success of this government, and it depends on the ability of the opposition. And those are frankly all unforecastable. All I would say to those of you who are probably all the Scots folks have gone off to the Scots celebration, but I would say for those who are fighting devolved elections or even fighting local council elections, don't bet on necessarily doing well in 12 months, 2 years' time. You could find it's quite a difficult game.
Very last question, briefly at the front here. Sorry, just in front of you. Thank you.
Thank you for taking the question. It seems to me that on the very obvious issues around Gaza, for example, more recently the winter fuel payments this year, at least to me, it seems that if there is a failure, it is a failure of communication more than anything else. Because you can recover from these things. Is that where you would see or would agree with that kind of position, or do you see it differently?
I fear that on Gaza, And I simply say I fear it is recognition of the intensity of the feelings on both sides of the argument. They are not to be underestimated. You can see them playing out in the Middle East, but they're also playing out in our politics here. With all due respect, I suspect that many of those who are military sympathetic to the Palestinian side of the cause will not have regarded it as simply a matter of communication, but rather a failure of understanding. Now, I'm not endorsing that view, but I think you probably need to understand that that is how many of them feel. More broadly, I would say to you, politics is the art of communication. So if the communication is wrong, the politics is wrong.
So John, I can't imagine anyone else in the country who could come here and say so many different difficult messages and to not lose one single member of the audience who are completely gripped by what you had to say. You're definitely the most popular, unpopular. I mean, you even at one point said, give the Tories a break. And I looked at the room going, you got away with it. So I want to say a huge thank you for joining us again for this. It has been so thought-provoking and I think so evidence-based and true and important for us all to take away with us today. So thank you very much. Thank you for brilliant questions.
You can probably corner me over a glass of wine if you want to disagree with me.
And he was offering kind of personalised polling service.
John, you must remember, I talked to you at Norton.
Oh, yes,
good
oh, good
I'm now
Lord,
Labour
hello.
councillor.
Oh, good Lord, hello.
You've done very well and you're still over there, that's who I am now.
Oh, gosh.
So
which ward do you represent?
Well, it's North.
It's
the most rich. No, it's not.
I'm very interested myself, really, and there were lots of, I think with like the additional parties as well, I sort of got bits of it wrong as well, because I feel like those, and I feel like that's something that's more, that actually takes more effect.